Hello there. Once again, Jeremy Corbyn is pronouncing that he and his Labour Party team would have Brexit sorted out in 6 months. So Jeremy Corbyn reckons he'll get Brexit sorted and have a referendum on it within 6 months of getting into office, should this country's electorate take leave of its senses and put him into number 10. For a start, that means yet another Article 50 extension beyond the 31st of January 2020. It also means restarting the Brexit negotiations from scratch. And Corbyn said he'd have that all wrapped up in 3 months, giving a further 3 months for referendum campaigning. And this is basically because what Corbyn would be putting together would be a soft Brexit, and in all probability the ultimate Brexit in name only. But of course all it would really be is an extremely poor deal that the EU would happily put together for him to be measured against remaining in the EU at that referendum. And most of Corbyn's team would then argue against the Labour deal and campaign for full remain. Does Jeremy Corbyn take our voters to be total fools? Well, he mustn't he? Especially when he says that he represents both the Leave side and the Remain side in the Brexit debate, and that his way would bring the country together. As if all those Brexiteers out there would be happy to be asked to vote again for something they'd already won. But this time the option they voted for last time would not be on the ballot paper. How delusional can Corbyn get? Moving on. While the Remainer parties talk about keeping us trapped inside the EU because they think that's where the future of the UK lies, we find out that according to the latest annual HSBC survey, the US has just overtaken Germany and France as the most common trading partner for UK businesses. Not only that, most of those businesses asked in the survey about their prospects said they had a positive outlook about their future. But listening to the Remainers, you'd think that a big black hole was opening up, wouldn't you? Now, Reuters reports that although the number of businesses that named the US as one of their top 3 trading partners dropped from 29% last year to 24% this year, there was a plummet in the rankings for both Germany and France, where the numbers dropped by about half to leave Germany on 16% and France on 15%, well below the US's 24%. And back in 2018, 74% of UK companies that were asked in the survey that year said they were positive about the future, but that figure has increased to standard 86% this year. Not only that, at 22%, the US was in the top position where growth potential by UK firms was concerned, with France, Canada and Germany coming in behind them. Also, consider that although the UK exports some £291 billion a year in goods and services to the European Union, our single largest export market country is the USA, where we send £121 billion in exports per year. But how can this be? Are we in a customs union with the US? Are we in a US single market? Do we contribute to a US political system just so we can trade with them? Do we have the freedom of movement of workers with the US? Does the US Supreme Court overrule our UK Supreme Court? And if the answer to those questions is no, then I ask the Remainers, what is the point of the European Union? But of course Remainers will now be wading in with talk of selling off the UK National Health Service to large US corporate businesses, taking away workers' rights and making the poor people eat what pro-EU types would label as substandard US food. Now, on NHS privatisation, apart from it being the Labour Party that started that off with that failed private finance initiative scheme that costs the NHS and taxpayers so dear, it is also laughable to try and deny that the NHS system is privatised just about right up to the point of delivery. The Labour Party seems to be claiming that the NHS is not currently driven by capitalist pressures. Well, it is. To completely free it from those market pressures, the NHS would need its own pharmaceutical research arm and be disallowed from buying in drugs. It would need its own pill and medicine manufacturing system. And here's a big one. It would need to run its own research non-power nuclear reactors to produce its own nuclear medicine isotopes. It would need its own computer hardware and software arm, as well as stationary production. Then there's the syringe and scalpel manufacturing to consider. And the list goes on, but everyone knows that would just be a nonsense. Now, what we do in reality, or what we should do, is use market forces to allow the NHS to purchase what it needs, either nationally or locally, in a manner that gets the best value for money. In reality, the debate is about where in the healthcare supply chain, between raw product and the patient, that the public service takes over full control, and that will always be a blurred line. At the end of the day, what matters most to me is that taxes fund the system and the patient gets it free at the point of need. And to make that sustainable would not include letting US companies just take over and charge what they like. But that is not going to happen, as all politicians left and right know it would end their party and their careers. And now we come on to food standards. Today, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said in a speech on a potential Tory US trade deal, "Given the chance, they'll slash food standards to match the US, where what are called acceptable levels of rat hairs in paprika and maggots in orange juice are allowed, and they'll put chlorinated chicken on our supermarket shelves." And here Corbyn has used the oft-repeated claims by Remainers that US food is of inferior quality to EU food. And to accomplish this, Remainers have homed in on and totally misused the Defect Levels Handbook produced by the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. This FDA handbook lays down what are called action levels for certain items in food, but the Remainers are using it as some sort of proof that US food is not as safe as food produced in the European Union. Business Insider, for example, said that doing a deal with Trump would mean insect-filled chocolates, rat hair noodles, and maggoty orange juice. And that piece goes on to say that US producers are allowed to put 30 insect fragments in a 1,000-gram jar of peanut butter, 11 rodent hairs in 25 grams of paprika, and 3 milligrams of rat poo in every pound of ginger. Makes it sound like the US population must be dropping like flies to food poisoning every day, doesn't it? So, why no warnings at UK airports and Foreign Office advice to take your own food or boil everything when you get there? Because it's a lot of nonsense, that's why. Writing in EUreferendum.com, an expert in this area, Richard North, explains that if found in foods, the levels quoted are action levels, and he explains, "These are action levels, the limits at which FDA will regard the food product adulterated, subject to enforcement action under Section 402A3 of the Food, Drug and Cosmetics Act. In other words, anything above the level specified is open to prosecution without any further consideration." But guess what? It turns out the European Union doesn't set these types of action levels. And you know that must be the case, otherwise those claiming this nonsense would do a direct comparison, item by item, number by number, to prove their case. But they haven't, have they? In fact, this means that an EU food producer could potentially exceed those US FDA parameters and not be prosecuted in the European Union. And further, to export food from the EU to the US, one presumes we would have to abide by those FDA action levels. Doesn't that therefore make those US FDA food rules tighter than EU rules? Especially, says North, as these are set maximum levels, and that the FDA will still take other action where levels are lower, in exactly the same way as the EU does. And Richard North says in his article, "This gives an element of predictability to those who sell food to the US. Unlike exporters to the EU, where arbitrary standards can sometimes be applied, those who trade with the US know where they stand." And then he goes on to add, "There is a rather insidious downside. Even in the UK, we find that port health authorities in different ports apply different standards. What might be rejected at one port can be rerouted to another where it can be accepted." And he ends by saying, "In short though, if the UK were itself to adopt action levels and then get the EU to follow suit, it would be no bad thing. As far as Brexit horrors go, this is not one of them." So, as far as I can make out, food that would be considered as unfit for consumption in the US could well be contaminating our EU food chain right now. Give that a thought. And another point to consider is, just remember that the US is consumer central, so no one selling shoddy goods, especially food, would last that long anyway. Now, when you listen to this tirade of anti-US and anti-Trump rhetoric from the left and the Remainers, it's coming to sound more and more like an almost anti-American xenophobic rant every day. They're pointing at the US and making up all sorts of unsubstantiated claims, and then they cry foul when President Trump turns up on the Nigel Farage LBC radio show to set the record straight. Yes, where those that want us to remain shackled to the EU are concerned, rational thought seems to exit the window every time. Anyway, what do you think? Please share and comment, and thank you for watching.